Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. Coconut coir has rapidly become my substrate of choice that I use for the majority of my boas. Today I'm going to discuss exactly what coconut coir is, go over the pros and cons of COCO coir versus some of the other types of substrates, and then demonstrate the optimal way to use this stuff in your reptiles enclosure. You're not going to want to follow the instructions on the label. There's really a better way to do that. So make sure you stay tuned as I demonstrate how best to prepare the COCO coir for your snake or reptiles enclosure. So first of all, what exactly is coconut coir? Well, if you've ever seen a coconut, you're familiar with the round nut that's got this nice hard shell. You got to crack open the shell, you get the milk out, you get the meat out, this nice white coconut meat. But there's actually an outer husk that contains a material called the coir. So the nut you buy at the grocery store has already had the coir removed, unless you go to some specialty stores where you can actually buy the coconut with the whole husk. But the size of the husk is actually several times bigger than the actual nut itself, and that contains material called the coir. So the coir is this pithy fibrous material that surrounds the nut, the part that we eat. And you can buy coconut coir in several different forms. So coir itself just refers to the outer material, but you can get it in several forms. This is actually called cocoa block chip, or the chip material, and this is the kind that you want for your reptiles because it has these nice small sized chips. They also sell something called cocoa peat, and cocoa peat is just the dust. So that's more useful for like gardening. You don't want the cocoa peat for your reptiles enclosure. And then they have something called cocoa fiber, which is the really stringy material. And this cocoa chip has a little bit of the fiber, but you really don't want too much of the fiber. So the optimal kind to buy is called cocoa chip. Okay, you don't want the peat or the fiber. So this is the Pro Coco brand, and this is one of the most commonly used brands. There's other brands of COCO coir as well, so experiment, but the majority of them come in this compressed block. Okay, so you're going to have to reconstitute the block with water before you use it in your reptiles enclosure. There are a few brands that come already ready to use in bags. You don't have to add the water, but those tend to be a lot more expensive. So you want to buy these blocks. And so COCO coir is actually a relatively new product. Before a few years ago, the material surrounding the coconut nut part was actually just discarded or composted, but they figured out it works really well for a variety of applications. Most notably, it's useful in gardening in a variety of different ways, but it also works really well as a reptile substrate. And so again, you want to buy the cocoa chip, not the cocoa peat or the cocoa fiber. Now for the pros and cons. And as I've said many times before, there's no perfect reptile substrate. I've tried all the different commonly used substrates. I've noted their strengths and weaknesses. And for right now, I find that this COCO coir, this cocoa chip, best fits my needs. And so I'm going to go over some of the pros. There's also a few cons you have to keep in mind. So the first pro is that reptiles and boas especially like to rest on this stuff. It's got this nice soft but slightly rough texture, and you may have noticed with a paper-based substrate your boa feels really uncomfortable, especially like on newspaper or a slick paper surface, but they really seem to like to rest on top of this stuff, and it makes them feel comfortable. And even if your boa looks okay on top of newspaper or a smooth paper substrate, boas have complicated behaviors that we're just beginning to understand. So in the long run, it might not be good behaviorally for your boa to be on a substrate that's nice and smooth like that. This stuff provides a little bit more grip, which maybe gives their belly muscles a little bit more of a workout, and they just seem to be more comfortable lying on top of it. The next advantage is that it maintains humidity really well because it's like a pithy, spongy material, so it just soaks up the water and then it keeps the humidity high. And if your reptiles and your boas are having difficulty shedding especially, and you can't seem to get the humidity high enough, I would definitely recommend giving this stuff a try because it just soaks up the water. You can spray it down, keep it nicely hydrated, and it'll keep your enclosure nice and humid. The third pro is that it lasts a relatively long time. Compared to the paper substrates, which you pretty much have to clean out and change completely every week, if not more often, this stuff will last quite a bit longer. Even compared to some of the other particulate or wood-based substrates, it lasts longer. So depending on how big your reptile is and how much it urinates and defecates, you might only need to change this stuff every few weeks to every few months. Of course, you're going to want to go in there, you're going to want to remove any feces and pieces of shed skin and any, debris that accumulates, but you don't really need to do a full change until it either starts to smell kind of funky, not fresh anymore, or if it starts to mold a little bit. So definitely an advantage, because you don't need to do the complete changes nearly as often as you would for some other substrates like aspen or newspaper. Another advantage with Coco Chip is that it's got this nice appearance. It's got kind of this organic look to it, this nice deep brown rich color, and it has a nice organic, kind of woodsy smell to it, but not overpowering. So definitely nice for both your ears and for your nose. In addition, it absorbs waste quite well because it's kind of spongy. So if your boa tips over the water dish or, believes itself, it's going to be absorbed. And you can go in and you can do a spot cleaning around the soiled area. A big advantage of this stuff over things like aspen is that it's got a lower dust amount. It's not dust free, but definitely easier on your lungs than the aspen, which I will never use again and do not recommend to use for anybody for any purposes. Avoid aspen. And then finally, this stuff is compostable. So when it's done in your snake cage, you can take it out to the garden, you can put it on your compost heap, you can just dispose of it in your yard. So if you're throwing away boa used substrates in your trash, it's taking up a lot of space in your garbage collection that you're allowed every week. There's very small garbage cans here in California. And so you want to reduce that as much as possible. It's also much more environmentally friendly because you're not hauling off the used substrate to the landfill. So good for the environment. Now for the cons of using COCO COIR. The first is that it's relatively expensive compared to other substrates. So this block right here costs about $20 or so, and the block, it says, is 4.5 kilos. They claim it makes 18 gallons of substrate. In my testing, it makes more like it looks like around 13, maybe 14 gallons tops. So not quite the same as they claim. And what I found is that one of these blocks is sufficient for 2 or 3 cage changes in a standard 4x2 foot boa cage, or in my big 30x40 inch vision tubs, I can get about 4 changes with one block. So you do the math, that's $20 divided by the number of cages. So it turns out to be a little more expensive than some other substrates. However, you don't need to change as often. So you save in that area, and then you save all the work you would have to put into changing those other substrates. So for me, it's definitely worth it to use this stuff, even though it costs a little more up front. And so part of the problem is that I can't find this stuff locally. I have to have it shipped, and I live in a relatively high populated area. I think because this stuff is new and it's just kind of catching on, you can't get it at Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart. So you basically, in the future, they might have more availability of this stuff, and the price might come down if you can just pick it up locally without having to have it shipped. Another disadvantage is you have to put in time to prepare this stuff, which I'll demonstrate in a few minutes. You can't just use it right out of the bag. In addition, it may be too humid. If you prepare it with too much water, it's going to end up too humid. It may even end up molding. So definite disadvantage. And then when you're changing this stuff, because it's these particles, it can be more labor intensive to change than, say, a simple paper substrate that you can just take out in one piece. In addition to being messier than some other substrates, it may be dirty as well, because there's little particles, again, called the peat, which are in as part of the whole, even though this is mostly the chips and a little bit of fiber. So the little peat particles will tend to form this kind of dirty layer on the bottom, and they tend to break down over time, which causes it to be kind of like dirt. So it's a little bit on the dirty side. Although COCO COIR seems a little more mold resistant than aspen, it still can mold, especially if you add too much water, which makes it really worthless and you have to throw it away and start with fresh material. And then finally, there's always the risk that your reptile might ingest some of the particles when it's eating its food. And I've never had any issues with this, although I try to offer the rat away from the coir, basically on top of a plastic hide, so my snake doesn't get any coir on the rat. But this stuff will stick to the dead rodent. Your snake can accidentally eat a little bit. Chances are if it eats a little bit, it'll just pass through it. but you know, it is still a risk. And if your snake did get too much of this stuff inside of its digestive tract, it could lead to impaction. Okay, now the important part. How do you prepare this stuff for use in your snake's enclosure? I found that simply following the instructions can lead to an unsatisfactory result, with the material being far too wet and humid. So basically they tell you, and I've seen other reptile keepers do this, to remove the block from the plastic and then you just dunk it in water, let it soak up. But if you do this, it's going to be way too wet and it can end up molding. So rather than following those instructions, I found the ideal way to prepare this stuff is to use a tub like this. Is a 14-gallon or 56-quart Sterilite tub, and you want to put your block in the tub and you want to add the optimal amount of water, which I've determined for my purposes is 1.5 to 2 gallons. You don't want to add any more water than that. You can test it. If it's not wet enough, add a little bit more, but you definitely don't want to add too much water. So first thing you want to do is take the coir block out of the package. Okay, so there's the coir block in the tub out of the wrapper. And so rather than just adding the water directly, I'm going to break it up first, which helps it to reconstitute faster. And this stuff is pretty much dust-free once you add the water. It can be a little dusty though when you're mixing it up. So I'm going to use this N95 mask to protect my lungs, and I recommend you do the same. Okay, hopefully you can hear me okay. Hopefully you're used to these things with the whole COVID thing going on. Anyway, I'm going to use a screwdriver. You can use any kind of a tool, a rigid metal tool, and you want to break it up thoroughly into pieces that are roughly fist size. Now that this stuff is thoroughly broken up, I'm going to add the water. I'm going to start with 1.5 gallons, which I've measured into my trusty red bucket. So just gently pour it over the top like this. Let that stuff soak it up like a sponge. And then you want to just mix it by hand. And what you'll find is that most of the water will go to the bottom. So you just have to keep mixing from the bottom to the top as it soaks up the water. And you want a moist consistency, but you don't want it to be wet. You don't want it to be dripping. You want it to be just kind of moist, so it's not going to be too humid for your reptile cage, but it will add the required humidity. And so usually I just mix it for a few minutes, so I'll stop the camera. I finished mixing the batch that I just mixed up, but this is a batch I made a little earlier. I actually used 2 gallons of water in this batch, which I think is pretty good. It's a little bit moist at the bottom. I'm probably going to add, you know, maybe another quart to the batch I prepared that's sitting over there. But this stuff feels pretty good. You can always let it dry for a day or two if it's not quite ready. You just don't want it to be dripping. So if you squeeze it, and if water is coming out, it's going to be too wet. And make sure you take from the bottom. So yeah, I can feel down here, it's still a little wet on the bottom. But you want a nice, even, moist consistency without too much water. One unusual thing I've noticed with this stuff is there's frequently little bits of plastic in there. I guess the factory where they're making it, they got like plastic wrappers and plastic material. So unfortunately, you sometimes have to pick up the little bits of plastic. You can't escape plastic. It's, you know, an environmental nightmare. I could go off for hours about how much I hate plastic, but here I am using it with this tub, so that's modern life. So once you're done mixing the coir and it's reached a level of even moistness and it's the suitable moisture level for your particular needs, you can put it in your reptile's enclosure. And typically I put about 1 inch of material on the bottom. It doesn't have to be too thick. It can be a little sparse in some areas, but about 1 inch seems to be the right amount for my boas. And you may notice that if you have a reptile cage that doesn't have very good ventilation, that it's fogging up the front door or the sides. And if that's the case, you want to go in and you want to wipe it down, remove the moisture, and keep doing that until it stops fogging up like that, because if it fogs up, it's going to be too humid for your reptile. It's probably going to end up molding, and once this stuff molds, it's pretty much done. You have to get rid of it and put in fresh material. So I would highly recommend you make sure that the coir is dry enough before putting it in your reptile's enclosure to avoid the molding. So that's a little bit about COCO COIR. Hope this video was helpful. I'd love to hear your experiences with the coir, particularly if you've worked with other brands other than COCO, Pro COCO. So please comment below. As always, if you have any questions or comments about Boas, feel free to shoot me a line. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your Boas.